For the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about St. Anselm's first formulation of his ontological argument. Now, that one was based upon the idea of the greatest possible being. But his second version, found in chapter 3 of his work, the Proslogion, is based upon the idea of a necessary being. Apologist Douglas Groothuis summarizes Anselm's second version of the argument like this. Premise 1. God is defined as a maximally great or perfect being. Premise 2. The existence of a perfect being is either impossible or necessary, since it cannot be contingent. Premise 3. The concept of a perfect being is not impossible, since it is neither nonsensical nor self-contradictory. The first conclusion, therefore, a perfect being is necessary. And finally, therefore, a perfect being exists. Now let's define some of these terms. Anselm lays out 3 types of beings: impossible, contingent, and necessary. An impossible being is one that can never exist. A necessary being is one that must exist, no matter what. And finally, a contingent being is one that either could or could not exist. We are all contingent beings. I mean, we exist, so obviously it's possible that we exist, but at the same time, if our parents hadn't procreated, we wouldn't be here. So it's also possible that we didn't exist. Those 3 options exhaust all the possibilities. Now, Anselm begins by pointing out that a perfect being cannot be contingent, because that would contradict the entire notion of a perfect being. You can't be perfect if you don't exist. So we can't have a perfect being that either might or might not exist. If a perfect being exists at all, it must exist necessarily. But that means that the only way for this perfect being not to exist is for it to be impossible. Even the most hardened skeptic will rarely try to claim that God's existence is impossible. It's not self-contradictory, like the idea of a married bachelor, for example. It's also not inherently nonsensical, like claiming something like apple jelly makes great music. But if it can't be contingent, and if it's not impossible, then the only remaining option is that it is necessary. And if a perfect being is necessary, that means that it must exist. Now, Norman Geisler and Paul Feinberg, in their book Introduction to Philosophy, A Christian Perspective, identify several challenges to this version of the ontological argument. Now, one criticism they point out is that one can argue that, granted, if a necessary being does indeed exist, then it cannot have a possible, i.e. contingent, kind of existence. But it is always logically possible that no necessary being exists. But are they correct? I mean, that logical possibility that they discuss is what Anselm was attempting to address in laying out the 3 logical possibilities. If Anselm is correct, and those are the only 3 options, and if he's correct in ruling out an impossible and a contingent existence, then the only option left is a necessary one. So it would not be logically possible that no necessary being exists. How you feel about Geisler and Feinberg's conclusion really depends upon whether you believe Anselm has carried the day. More recently, Alvin Plantinga has made some modifications to the ontological argument to incorporate the concept of what's called possible worlds. Next week, we'll see whether he was successful. See you then. God bless.